Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Chax Chat podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Creative Pro. And Creative Pro, Dax and I will be at the Creative Pro Week conference, which is coming up on June 29th to July 3rd this year in Nashville, Tennessee. So if you want to hang out in Nashville and have some fun and get some great knowledge about creative applications, including InDesign, Illustrator, Photoshop, Acrobat, all of that great stuff, be sure to check out Creative Pro Week this year, which is live and in person. My name is Chad Chilius. I am accessibility wizard here at Chax Training and Consulting, and I'm also an Adobe certified expert as well.
My name is Dax Castro. I am the other accessibility wizard here at Chax Training and Consulting. Although someone did say I am the PDF whisperer, the PDF document whisperer. I thought that was an interesting nomer. And Chad and I both certified as accessible document specialist by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And if you'd like your certification too, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org and click on certifications. Hey, Chad, one of the things we might want to let everybody know is that we're going to be doing a podcast live from Creative Pro Week.
We are.
Be looking for that we're working with Creative Pro to actually do a joint presentation or a joint podcast while we're out on scene. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, that's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome.
Doing it on location in Nashville. So that'll be something new. Well, we've done one in California. Yeah, right? You and I have done a Chax Chat podcast at CSUN in California. That was, a couple of years ago, I think, right?
A few.
But yeah, so it's always exciting when we get to like switch it up and do something at a different location. I think it really makes it quite interesting.
Well, maybe this is opportunity to do a road show. If you are an organization that wants to come have a live podcast where you can do a ask the experts anything kind of situation, we'd be happy to come out and we'll figure it out. Maybe we get enough people, we can string it together and do a little road show from East Coast to West Coast, kind of our coast to coast.
I love that idea. I love it. Yeah.
That'd be super. Well, today, Chad, you had a topic you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I did. And again, so what I wanted to talk about was page navigation in PDF files, right? And this is not exactly a new topic for us on this podcast. I know we've discussed it at different lengths, at various times along the way. But recently, I have encountered several of them. Right. In the work that I've been doing.
Page up and page down's pretty easy, right? Just page up and page down.
Yeah, exactly. But so like the problem with page navigation. So the fundamental problem, right, is that, as a sighted user, we have the ability to use page navigation or not use page navigation. Right. Let's
reframe this a bit. Let's pull back a little bit further. Right. So when we talk about page navigation, we're not talking about page up, page down.
Okay. I see where you're going.
That's not what we're talking about. I tried to throw you a softball,
okay, I'm
Chad,
sorry.
and you missed it.
I didn't pick up what you were laying down.
Swing and a miss. All right. So Chad, page up and page down is pretty easy, right?
You're right. It is. And technically that is page navigation, right? The page navigation that I'm referring to is the visual page navigation that people like to incorporate into a PDF file, often mimicking the behavior of a web page, right? Like whenever we go to a web page, we always have, buttons at the top, for menus that take us to different locations on the site. And people like to replicate that behavior by building navigation into a PDF file as well. So, you have a button that says, take me to the table of contents. Then you have a button that says, take me to chapter 1 and take me to this section or take me to that section. And, it creates a challenge. And so where I was going previously was, as a sighted user, when there's page navigation on the page, I get to choose whether I want to use it or not. Right. And I don't really have to actively do it either. Right. I can kind of like glance at it and be like, oh, I'm not interested. And then I can continue reading the content on the page. The challenge that it creates for users of assistive technology is that they're forced to read it at the beginning of every page in the document.
Well, and the reason that they're forced to begin to have to read it, because you're like, well, why? Why can't they just skip it? Well, here's the thing. When a button or an object has an action, that action is an annotation. And an annotation is the instructions that tell that button that when I'm pressed or activated to do something, move to a certain page in a certain zoom level, or maybe if you used text anchors in InDesign, that annotation tells it to go to that specific word, right? So that annotation can't be skipped. It can't be untagged in a document, right? So you can't say, well, I'm just going to mark it as an artifact and just allow sighted people to click on the back to TOC or not, because then it will make our checkers say, nope, can't do it because you have an untagged annotation. You have an action with no button. And that is the problem, because we as sighted users can just not activate it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like as I was saying before, like as a sighted user, again, again, I don't think we really actively do this, or we're not really like paying attention, but we could see the navigation and we could choose immediately whether we want to use it or not, right?
Well, we do this in websites. We scroll down. Like you go to a website, the first thing you do is scroll down. You choose not to look for in the menu, but then sometimes you're like, I need to find this specific area in the website, and you don't look at the rest of the content on the homepage. You drill into the menu. And it's that kind of mentality that freedom that we get as sighted users, non-assistive technology users, because not all people using assistive technology are non-sighted. But as we use this tool, we can choose to do it or not. And the mechanics of not clicking on the button is simply moving your eyes farther down the page.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. But, and as you pointed out, Dax, like the minute you have a button, it's got to be tagged. Because if you don't, you know, when you run a checker, you're immediately going to get an error that says untagged annotation, right? So, and again, I think it's one of those areas where people often get confused because they're like, oh, I don't need to tag that button. Oh, well, you do, right? You know, like the minute you put it on the page, it's got it. Because like the theory, right, is an equitable experience, right? And so if it's there for one group of people, it's got to be there for another group of people as well, right? And so, but unfortunately, for one group of people, it's much easier to ignore and kind of look past it, and another group of people, it's not, right? So when we tag it, Dax, right, now it's content in the document that needs to be read, right?
Or skipped. Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. And I was getting there, right? So the fundamental problem though with that navigation is that it will be read at the beginning of every page, right? Because you've got those buttons, you know, that appear at the top of every page. So we tag those buttons, and now all those elements are going to be read at the top of every page. And so, you know, think about it. A lot of times you've got content that flows from the bottom of one page to the top of the next page, right?
Right.
And so having those items read can be a very disruptive experience.
Yep.
Because now a user that's in the process of reading content, right in the middle of that, they're going to hear, home, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, whatever your section markers are. And it really creates just a very disruptive experience for the user.
Well, and I think that, we've seen this implemented in a couple of different ways. I think it used to be, we would see that more of the back to top or back to TOC as that single button that would live in the bottom right-hand corner or the top right-hand corner of a PDF. And so what does that mean for the end user? That means as they move from one page to the other, the end of the page, maybe in the middle of the sentence, they're going to hear button back to TOC. And then click here to go back to the TOC. If the button was tagged correctly, it should have a tooltip, and that tooltip should say, click here to go back to the TOC. So they're going to hear that midstream of their reading the page. I don't think that's as obtrusive. I think it'd be annoying, but I don't think it'd be as obtrusive as hearing 7 navigation buttons across the top of the page because someone's decided they want to turn a PDF into a mini website.
Right. Well, and similarly, Dax, is another area where we kind of get a little hung up on, where people will often at the bottom of one page will put text that says continued on next page. Right. And again, I mean, that's really for the benefit of a sighted user, right? Like yep. It's really for a sighted user to remind them that, hey, this story keeps going on the next page. For somebody using assistive technology, they don't need that help, because as they're reading the content, it's just going to naturally go there, and they're going to read the content on that next page. So the value of having that is minimal.
Well, and the good thing is, if you're using Adobe InDesign, you can create a paragraph style called artifact. Mm-hmm. Create your paragraph style called continue on next page, and make that an artifact. However, I'm getting there with you, Chad. I got Chad's already ready to jump on this. But what you have to do is you have to put that continue on next page in its own frame, unanchored from the body copy, because if you have an artifacted piece of text anchored inside another piece of text, it will artifact the entire frame of the content. So you'll have one little thing that's supposed to be artifacted, but unfortunately InDesign can't figure that out, and it artifacts the entire block of text, right? That's where you were going?
Actually, it wasn't where I was going. Where I was going was everything you said was right until you make that text a hyperlink.
Oh, yeah.
And now you're back to that same problem of the minute you make it a hyperlink, now that hyperlink needs something to attach itself to.
Well, and that's because it is not continue on next page where you see that. It's continue on page 12 where you see that. So typically in a magazine layout, you'll continue on next page. No one's making that a hyperlink. But when
they are.
Well, they shouldn't be.
I agree, just dumb. But I'm telling you, I just saw the document, and I'm like, they made it a link to go to the next page. I'm like, it's just the next page. I don't need a hyperlink for it,
But there's another magazine that we deal with where they do continue. They write the magazine like a traditional magazine where they're puzzle piecing these articles into the different pages. So it might say continue on page 12, column 2. And that is a hyperlink to page 12, right? And so I don't necessarily hate that, because the screen reader user needs that information. That's a useful navigation link to get them to the right place, right? But things like continue on next page or this page intentionally left blank is another one of my pet peeves.
Yeah.
When they just have a single page because they're trying to paginate it the correct way. Fine. Artifact that. No one needs to hear this page left intentionally blank. And in fact, I hate even seeing the text on the page as a sighted person. I'm like, why would you make my ADHD brain focus on that text? Just leave it blank. I get it. I understand.
Like, I get it. I get it. It's a blank page.
Or just put a ruler, put a rule in there in the middle to show that you meant to not make it blank. But don't put words in there.
Or put a photo on there. right?
Yeah, right.
Like put a
Why
interesting
waste the
photo,
real estate?
you know?
Yeah. So all in all, guys, what we're talking about here is the bigger question. Should you have navigation inside your PDF? Well, I will tell you that it's not wrong. It's not wrong to have that navigation in your PDF. You just have to, one, understand the barriers. Two, be prepared to spend the time to do the workarounds to make it a good user experience. Because Chad, let's talk about what we do when we get to that navigation bar, right? There's a couple of different ways we can manage that to make it a better user experience, to give that screen reader user some more flexibility in being able to navigate that content a little better.
Right. And it's funny, Dax, because I've given this a little bit of thought recently, and so I wanted to tell you, and you could tell me what you think about this. But so what Dax and I have done in a lot of these projects that we work on that have these navigations, because again, like fundamentally is not a great user experience. So what we wanted to do is give the user the ability to not have to listen to that navigation at the top of every single page. So what Dax and I have done is we will create hidden text, right? And you could do that a couple of different ways depending on the situation. One could be to put text there and make it the same color as the background so that it's not visibly.
I tend not to do that one because you're not going to pass a checker if you've got that text, especially the new PAC 2026. It's not going to get past that.
It'll definitely be a WCAG. It'll be a WCAG violation, right? Because you've got
the AI will also make it.
But so the other thing we'll do is, or we'll hide text, right? And so this text that we're hiding, what we do in that text is we say, press H to skip the navigation, right? And so fundamentally what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the construction of the document. It only works if you have a heading at the top of every page, right? Because pressing H in JAWS or NVDA is going to read the next heading. So what we're saying when we tell people to say press H to skip the navigation, instead of having to listen to all of those items in the navigation, they press H, which then jumps across all those navigation elements and reads the first heading on the page.
So I will tell you my preferred method. It's the only method I use when I'm doing this navigation bypass, is that every button in the navigation has to have a tooltip. It has to have alt text, right? It's got to have a tooltip. So if my first button is home or TOC, instead of making the tooltip just say back to home, I say press H to skip this navigation, and then I say home. I do a period and then home. So that way the user hears the button the way it's supposed to be, plus this little extra tooltip. And I didn't have to hide text on the page. I didn't have to do any black hat, and he didn't have to do anything sneaky. I just literally added it to the beginning of the alt text for that first object. And it makes it a very nice user experience. It doesn't flag any checkers. It literally just makes it nice and seamless. But you and I both know, we just talked about that experience where if you're in the middle of a paragraph and you move from one piece of content, half of the sentence to the other half of the sentence, there isn't a heading in between the two. So what do you do in that instance? So this goes back to a couple of different options. This is where we say designing with accessibility in mind. If I know that I'm going to use this navigation and I know it's a barrier, then I know I need to make sure that every one of my pages starts with some kind of heading. And if I can't do that, then I need to understand that there's a barrier. And so what I would suggest is that you could, I think that you just have to understand that that's going to be a barrier for that piece of content. And maybe you make up the word continued right? You could put continued at the top of that starting of that page because it continues from the previous page. So when they press H, they go to continued and then hear the rest of the text. It wouldn't be visually appealing. It wouldn't be typical, but it'd be a way to solve it. Or if you're like, look, there's one place in this document where this happens, or two places. We're okay with it being a crappy user experience in these two places because it just doesn't fit our layout.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, when we're talking about that scenario of text kind of continuing from a previous page, realistically, you'll probably put the navigation after one of the paragraphs or tags that fell on that second page, right? Like it's not really going to be in the middle of the paragraph. You're
right, Chad.
Yeah, you're
right.
probably going to position it. So what I would say is you at least have to make sure that there's a heading after the navigation to jump to, right?
That makes perfect sense, Chad. I didn't think about that. So everybody envision in your mind the tags tree, right? We don't care what the page looks like. We're just envisioning our tags tree. And we have a heading that is our paragraph on page 3. And then we've got 3 paragraphs that is the copy for the text that follows. Now, 2 of those paragraphs, or maybe even 2 and a partial, are on page 3, and the other 1 paragraph or part of is on page 4. We would never stick the navigation bar, that series of now buttons or P tags or whatever it is in whatever container, into the middle of that P tag. We would find some place in that hierarchy to put it. The most optimal place, I think this is exactly what you were saying, Chad, is the most optimal place is to find the next heading in that sequence and put it right before that heading. So when they hear navigation, then they could then skip it and go to the next heading. I think the only thing to think about is that in a discussion to someone using assistive technology, their brain is creating a picture of what this page looks like. That picture is going to be different than what a sighted person would. So if someone were talking about, well, at the top of page 12, there's this paragraph where it talks about whatever, they might not be able to clearly understand where that is spatially because you've moved that navigation bar kind of farther down the road. But I think that's a really small trade-off for a much better user experience. So I think you're right on with exactly what you're talking about.
And the thing that I wanted to bring up to you, right, because I feel like using the phrase press H to skip navigation is a little abrupt, right? Because you're just kind of saying this statement like...
Yeah, I think you would say navigation menu.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Like, I feel like I'd want it to say beginning of navigation, press H to skip navigation. And I know this is very subtle, right? This is a very subtle nuance here. But I just think, you and I are always on the side of the user experience. And in that discussion, I just feel like it would be a better experience to say beginning of navigation, press H to skip the navigation. And then
I think as I'm thinking about it, I would probably, I try to stop. I try not to say begin or end or any of that when I'm doing my tooltips or my things, because it is inherently the beginning regardless, right? I would probably just say navigation menu or navigation bar, press H to skip, period, right?
Yep.
And because they don't need to, the extra information is just extra words. And the fewer words I can use to get you through a section, the better off I'm going to be.
Sure.
So I might just say navigation bar, press H to skip.
That works.
And
too.
then,
yeah,
but this goes back to, what we were talking about for what we've talked about in the past with alt text. When you write alt text, it is so important to go back and listen and reread and say it out loud and get comfortable with what you're hearing, because there's always a way to pare it down a little bit more without making it sound too robotic or too sparse, because you don't want it to be nav, skip, right? I mean, it needs to
Right.
make logical sense, but you don't need to say, you don't need to write an entire paragraph about this menu sits at the beginning of every page.
Oh,
Start
no.
page, start navigation. And I don't think you're saying that, but I think there's a balance somewhere in the middle there of how do I give them enough information to know what this is and as little information to not interrupt their flow as much as possible.
For sure. For sure. And listen, I think what I want everybody to take away from this is to just always be thinking about, what that experience is going to be for somebody other than yourself, right? Because, we as sighted users have a tendency to struggle to kind of understand what that experience is. And the best way to understand is to start using a screen reader, right? Like start learning how to test with a screen reader. And it really does reveal issues that you never would have thought about otherwise, right? I mean, how many times have you been doing it, Dax, where we're like testing a document, I hear something, and I'm like, ooh, right? Like I wasn't expecting that and I don't like it. What can I do to make it better? And I just think that's important.
We always hear people ask us the question, how does it sound when blah, blah, blah?
Yeah.
And I will tell you, the only person you should ever ask that question to is yourself. Yeah. I absolutely think you should ask the question, but it should only be to yourself. You should be able, if you are doing document accessibility and not testing it with a screen reader, you're going 75% the way there.
Yeah. Because when somebody asks me that question, the truth is I usually don't know the answer, right? And it's often like a very obscure question. Like, how is my blah, blah, blah going to sound with a screen reader? I'm like, I don't know, right? The only way I'm going to know is if I open it up and test it. And then we will all know, but, so like, it's and again, Dax and I teach a class, on learning how to use a screen reader, so if you're interested, go onto the Chaks TC website. I'm sure we've got a class coming up, relatively soon, but, it's very worthwhile because it's just how we know, what that experience is going to be.
Yeah. Go to chakstc.com. We've got lots of classes. Our classes are 3 hours and you might think that's long, but honestly, what we found out is it is the sweet spot between overwhelming and not getting enough. And we know that, you don't always have 3 hours to block out in your day. Then this class might not be the class for you. I mean, if you're looking for a 30-minute or a 60-minute class on how to do something, there's YouTube videos out there. But if you want to understand it and walk away with real concrete knowledge, you need some time.
And listen, in 3 hours, you are not going to be bored, right? I mean, it's 3 hours of...
Not in my class.
No. Dax, I used to teach 6-hour classes.
Oh, that's brutal. Live classes, 6 hours is not bad, but 6 hours staring at a computer screen, I don't care who you are.
I am so glad we switched that. Switched it up and went to a 3 hour because it's much more manageable. I think it's more manageable from a learning standpoint, but also from a teaching standpoint, because after talking for 6 hours, I'm kind of fried.
Yeah. Nope. I hear you. I can't imagine, I use ChatGPT a lot, right? And I use a program for my computer called Whisper, WHSPR, and it's a voice chat program. So I can talk while I hold down the Control and Alt key and it types for me. Mm-hmm. And I tell you though, as nice as that is, by the end of the day, if I'm doing a lot of that, boy, it's a lot of talking that you just don't, people say, oh, I can't wait for the days where I could just talk to my computer and tell it what to do. Yeah, I'm not sure that's a dream I want to come true.
And I'll tell you what kills me is come winter time. And if I'm getting a little bit of a cold,
sure,
after talking for 3 hours, now it's a big cold, right? I lose my voice and I'm like struggling to talk, it's really tough. But all good stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Well, guys, I hope that this has given you some valuable information to understand what the cost is for having navigation in your PDF. And if you don't have the time to pay that cost, you should skip it. You should not have navigation. I'm not telling you never have navigation in your PDF documents, but you need to address it.
Well, and Dax, let's talk for a second about alternatives to navigation. Right?
Okay.
So like what could we include in our document that would provide a user with a way to get to various parts of the document without putting in navigation?
Well, the one way that everybody wants to jump to is bookmarks. And bookmarks are the worst way to give a person with using assistive technology any kind of functionality whatsoever. Because when
they're hard to get to, right?
Well, they're hard to get to switch between the bookmarks bar and the page content. There are three main areas in your navigation for a PDF. When you press F6, it goes from the navigation. Well, let's start with on page. You're on the page. Your page is the focus. Then you move to the sidebar. That might be where the bookmarks bar is, right? Then you activate a bookmark. It changes the page content, but it doesn't push you back to the page content. You now have to press Shift F6 or F6 twice to get back to that circle of navigation so that you're back to on-page content again. And a bookmark does not take you to a specific word. It only takes you to the top of the page.
To the page,
So if you happen to have content that is somewhere in the middle of that page, the user still has to hunt for it. So yes, it can be a navigation aid. For me, as a person with ADHD, absolutely. I'd rather skim through bookmarks than read an entire document to figure out what's useful for me. They are definitely helpful. But for a person using assistive technology, a TOC is probably your best use, because in InDesign, you can absolutely set the exact word that it goes to by using a text anchor to get right to that spot.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking, is a table of contents, right?
Right.
I think if there's one thing I wish the screen readers would do is give us a quick way to get to the table of contents. Because the table of contents has a unique tag,
Yeah.
And so I think it would be a great tool to, because like if I'm on page 27 and I'm like, oh, I'd really like to get to this section of the document. Well, how do I know where that section is? Well, the table of contents is a great way to get there. Right now, I just have to like navigate back to page 3 or wherever the TOC is and go through the TOC to find where I'm at, where it'd be great if the screen readers could take me directly to the TOC.
The problem with that is I just had to do a quick check before I open my mouth, because I always like to make sure I'm right. Well, at least ensure the probability that I'm correct before I open my mouth. There's no ensuring I'm right 100%. But the reason it's a problem is because a TOC is not a TOC. It's not a tag. It's a link. And so I can press K to move to, how do you differentiate between a link tag and a TOC tag when they're both links, right? So in the TOC, remember, NVDA and JAWS, they're not reading every single tag at a tag level. They're looking for functionality. And so when you have a link, that link lives inside a TOC. That's just the container that it's in. Just like a P tag, you have the content object itself, and then you have the tag it lives in. So when you go to, like, that's why there's no shortcut key for next paragraph, because there's no distinctive object. And H1 is a distinctive object. It is an actual heading. So I don't know enough about the behind the scenes thing, but I can definitely see how do you differentiate between a link on a TOC and a link somewhere else in the document if that structure, that defining tag, is above the actual item. Because you're going to have a TOC, a TOCI, then you're going to have a link tag or a reference tag, and then the link OBJR. There's all that structure in there. Where does it go? right? And so that I can see how that could be a problem. I don't think it's something that couldn't be solved.
Yeah.
I just don't think anybody's really trying to solve it. And I think maybe when we go to CSUN next year, we'll bring that up. Maybe we'll do a couple use cases and see if we can submit that. Maybe even submit it on their ticket sheet between now and then, because NVDA and JAWS both have ways
Right.
to submit improvements.
And they're both usually at CSUN. So
Yeah.
we certainly could go up and have the conversation for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely good stuff.
Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. And just as a reminder, the next place you could see Dax and I is at the Creative Pro Week conference, which is coming up on June 29th to July 3rd in Nashville, Tennessee. And so we'd love to see you in person, but also the conference is going to be online. So if you're not able to travel to Nashville, you can still attend virtually. So we hope to see you there. My name is Chad Chilius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where every other week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.